Okay, hello everybody. Welcome, one and all. It is Thursday, I think, Thursday, the 4th of April, 2024. Today we're celebrating a few holidays. It's National School Librarian Day. It's National Vitamin C Day. You don't really need to pay much attention to that one. It's also National Burrito Day. I'm a little bit more on board with that. Don't forget we have a full solar eclipse coming up next week on Monday, I believe. So I hope you're getting excited for that. Welcome to Skeptical Inquirer Presents, a series of live online presentations by experts devoted to all the good things, promoting science over pseudoscience, media literacy over conspiracy theory, and critical thinking over magical thinking. I'm Dr. Nick Tiller. I'm an exercise scientist and researcher at Harvard UCLA, and I'm a fellow of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. And most importantly, I'm your humble host for this evening's festivities. If you haven't done so already, make sure you get yourself a subscription to Neil deGrasse Tyson's favorite magazine, Skeptical Inquirer, the magazine for science and reason, the official publication of the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry. If you subscribe to the print edition, you will automatically get access to the online version, which is where I write my monthly column, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. For more information, visit the website skepticalinquirer.org. Be sure to mark your calendars for the next installment of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. The date and the speaker are to be confirmed, so keep an eye on the website for more details. All right, just a couple of very brief housekeeping things so I can lay the table before I introduce tonight's speaker. The session is scheduled for 60 minutes, give or take 1 or 2 minutes, so we hope to finish around 8 o'clock Eastern time. And we will hopefully have plenty of time for questions. So if you think of something along the way, please enter it in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Well, at least it's on the bottom of my screen. It goes without saying that please be respectful and constructive. We'll get through as many questions as possible, so keep your questions short and to the point. As I say, most of the time, keep them lean and keep them clean. And lastly, this session is being recorded and it will be made available online after the event has closed. Okay, so without further ado, on to tonight's speaker. Dr. Christopher Labos is a cardiologist with a degree in epidemiology. He writes regularly for the Montreal Gazette and hosts a brilliant science and skepticism podcast called The Body of Evidence. He's also speaking to you today as an author of a great new book that I have here. I have my inscribed copy, Does Coffee Cause Cancer? And 8 More Myths About the Food We Eat. And I'm sure he's going to be talking to you about that today. So without further ado, Christopher, you have the con.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. All right, let's jump straight into it as I share my screen and get the presentation going. All right, and we are immediately at the end of the presentation rather than the beginning. 1 second as I fix this. And there we go. All right, so does coffee cause cancer? A question that I know all of you have been asking yourselves repeatedly ever since you heard about this presentation. Before we get into it, let me present with you my disclosures. I don't have any. That's why I put up this picture. This is a painting of Hippocrates refusing a gift from Artaxerxes III. I do this because I don't have any financial disclosures. I do not accept money from the pharmaceutical industry because I feel that it's important. If you're going to be a public-facing person and talking about health and misinformation, you have to be able to respond to the claims that you are a pharmaceutical company shill, and I'm not, because I don't take money from the pharmaceutical industry. All that to say, the talk for today is about this problem. You could be forgiven if you thought that this is how the media writes news headlines, right? You spin 3 wheels and you find out that coffee can cause depression in twins. And then you spin it again the next day and you find that red wine can cause breast cancer in rats. And you would be forgiven for thinking this because at one point, every food has been shown to both cause and prevent cancer, right? If each of these red dots is one medical study, you can see that everything from wine to tomatoes to tea to milk to eggs to corn to coffee to butter to beef has at some point been shown to both cause and prevent cancer. And of course, if you're surfing the internet, you will see that coffee can both help you live longer and is also a probable carcinogen. You will see that fish oils are both helpful and useless for fighting heart disease. And you can go down a very deep rabbit hole looking at the difference between low carb, high fat and low fat, high carb diets. And this is problematic for somebody like me because, it's very hard to fact check the internet. Now, this talk is not going to be about fraud, although that's obviously a problem, right? This talk is not going to be about the difficulties of translating basic science to the bedside, even though that too is a problem. And this is not going to be a talk about the difficulty of translating animal studies into human studies, even though that too is a problem, because just because something is toxic to animals does not mean it's toxic to humans. And of course, by the same token, just because something is toxic to humans does not mean that it is toxic to animals. If this was true, we'd have to outlaw chocolate as being dangerous because it will kill your dog if your dog happens to eat it. What this talk is actually about is the errors in logic that make us believe things that are not true. Because when we read a study or hear about a study reported on the news, what we see is X associated with Y. That's what the study actually shows. But what our brains interpret is that X causes Y. That's what we end up assuming. And this is a problem because, as I'm sure you've heard multiple times, correlation does not equal causation. And of course, there are some very, very famous examples of when correlation does not equal causation. For example, the average age of Miss America is very tightly correlated with the number of murders by steam and hot vapors that occur in the US every year. US spending on science, space, and technology is very tightly correlated with the number of suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. And as most of us learn in school, the number of people who drown by falling into a pool is directly correlated with the number of films that Nicolas Cage has appeared in. And while all of these things are correlated, they are not causal. And it's important to remember this, because while these are obvious, humorous, and funny examples, there are some not funny examples out there. Because there was a time when people genuinely believed that polio was caused by ice cream. And that's because polio cases would peak in the summer and ice cream sales would peak in the summer. And so you'd see a graph like this and you'd say, aha, polio must have something to do with ice cream. And of course it doesn't. We know polio is caused by a virus. We've developed a vaccine against it. And you might say, all right, Chris, that's fine. You're picking some obviously hilarious examples to make fun of people who you don't like. No. There's a reason why I'm showing you this stuff, because even today, even, 70 years after the fact, we're still making the same types of mistakes. Because while we can have a good chuckle about the idea that polio is caused by ice cream, there are some very serious people out there that are trying to convince you that polio is actually more closely related with pesticide use, and that the reason why we have less polio is because we use less pesticides, ergo, you don't need the polio vaccine. And this argument is compelling to people when you show them a graph like this. So the point of this talk and of the book in general is to explain to people why, when you see X is associated with Y, because that's what the study shows, you have to remember that there are 5 possible alternative explanations. It could be that X causes Y. It could be that Y causes X. It could be due to random chance. It could be due to bias. And it could be due to confounding. And so this is the book. This book is explaining to you, or is going to explain to you, if you read it, why health headlines can be particularly misleading. But this isn't really a science book. It's actually a romantic comedy. And so if you wanted to see what the book is like, you can actually go. We did an episode of the podcast where we read out one of the chapters as an audio play. You can actually find a free preview of the audiobook online. And so the point of the book is to try to weave all the science into a narrative that people will enjoy. But the science of the book is really underlying this basic concept that there are alternative explanations for every type of study. And this is what we're going to try to look at. Because when you see that X causes Y, or that X leads to Y in association, it's of course equally likely from the mathematical standpoint that Y could lead to X. Now, very obviously, cause must precede effect. right? Effect cannot precede cause. Smoking causes lung cancer. Lung cancer doesn't make you smoke more. But it's important to remember that Ronald Fisher, who invented the p-value, believed that lung cancer made you smoke more for a very, very long period of time. So even very, very smart people can be fooled by this. Because while you think this is obvious, sometimes it isn't. And we're going to talk about something that I guarantee most of you have believed at some point in your lives, and that is the idea that red wine is good for your heart. Because you have probably seen a study or some variant of a study like this that showed the U-shaped association where the more alcohol you drink, the more beneficial it is up until you get to an excessive amount, and then it starts to peak upwards again. And so the best part is the part here in the middle, and the people who drink no alcohol have a higher risk. And that has led to many interactions like this in the medical clinic where patients come in to see me and they say, doctor, I'm trying to do everything that I can. I control my blood pressure and cholesterol, diabetes, but it's really hard for me to drink 2 glasses of wine every day because I really just don't like alcohol. I get that a lot. And I have to explain to them that actually this is due to something called reverse causation, formally and scientifically referred to as the sick quitter effect or the protopathic bias. And this happens because most people drink some alcohol, right? There's very few people who drink zero alcohol. Obviously, some people drink zero alcohol for religious reasons or cultural reasons. But there's many people who drink zero alcohol for medical reasons because they, developed high blood pressure or developed some medical problem. They were told by their doctor, cut back on the alcohol. And we have to realize that there's a difference between former drinkers and never drinkers. And so this graph looks very impressive until I unhide a section of the graph that I have carefully concealed to show you this. Because when you look at the association between heart disease and alcohol, you realize there's a big discrepancy between former drinkers and never drinkers. The former drinkers are at much higher risk. And that's because people with severe disease, whether it be heart disease or cancer or some other medical problem, they quit drinking because they were told to by their doctor. That's why it's called the sick quitter effect. So it's not that abstaining from alcohol causes disease. It's that people who develop diseases abstain from alcohol. It's not that X causes Y. It's that Y causes X. And so this phenomenon, called reverse causation, is one of the reasons why we see this type of U-shaped association and why many people believed for a very, very long time that alcohol was good for your heart. Let me take a brief second to remind you that alcohol is really not all that good for you. It actually does increase the risk of cancer, especially not just liver cancer, but even something like breast cancer. It's important to remember that. Alcohol causes birth defects if you drink it while pregnant. It makes you fat because there's a lot of calories in it. And the antioxidants in alcohol do nothing. Resveratrol has been studied and has no real medical benefit. So it's important to remember that alcohol is not health food. Now, I'm not telling you can't drink alcohol. You certainly can, in the same way that you can eat ice cream and eat French fries if you truly want to. But what's problematic is the belief that many people have that alcohol is good for you, and the fact that many people justify their consumption of alcohol thinking it has health benefits when it really doesn't. So that was reverse causation. Let me show you an alternative explanation, the second one on our list, which was reverse causation. So let's assume that we didn't completely miss the obvious. Could this all just be due to random chance? Could the association we saw be due to random chance? And the reality is that people underestimate how much random chance affects medical research because, this association between Nicolas Cage and falling into a pool, this is obviously random, right? But our brains can recognize this as random because it is so humorous and so implausible. But we don't always pick up on that in medical research. And to show you and to illustrate the example, I'm going to talk to you about a very famous trial in cardiology, which is called the ISIS-2 trial. Now, the ISIS-2 trial was a famous study that showed that aspirin, if you take it when you're having a heart attack, is going to decrease cardiovascular complications after a heart attack. Interesting to point out that this only dates from 1988. So prior to that, we did not give aspirin to people who had a heart attack, which is an interesting historical little tidbit. But while the trial was overall positive, there was one subgroup of people whom did not benefit. And usually when I give this talk, I usually ask people in the audience, can you guess which subgroup did not benefit from the aspirin. And usually people will say diabetics, people who are on blood thinners. They come up with a lot of, very credible and very intelligent guesses. But they're all wrong, because in the ISIS-2 trial, the group who did not benefit from aspirin were Geminis and Libras, whereas all the other astrological signs did show a very significant benefit in mortality. And the authors of the study did this deliberately. They did this to show that all these subgroup analyses should be taken less as evidence about who benefits than as evidence that such analyses are potentially misleading. Because if you do a whole bunch of analyses, just by random chance, one of them will come up positive. So let me show you why this happens. Because now we get to do some math, because math is awesome, and I will fight anybody who suggests the opposite. We're going to talk about a paper that was published in the BMJ back in 1994, and it was called Miracle Dice Therapy. And what researchers did, they went to a neurology conference, and in one of the seminars, they took all the attendees and said, we're going to do an experiment. They gave them all green, white, and red dice. And they said, these dice represent a potential therapy for stroke, and there are 3 different therapies. And we're just going to roll them randomly. And if you roll a 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, there's no event, right? The patient survives the stroke. If you roll a 6, it meant the patient died from a stroke. And the students attending that class during that conference were told that some of the dice might be more effective than others or less effective. So some of the dice might be loaded. And the students went and they rolled dice after dice after dice and generated this, data table. I mean, today we would do this with a computer and a random number generator, but there was something, I think, fun for people to generate the data themselves by rolling the dice, to give them sort of a hands-on thing. And what the students did, that they found that the green and the white dice were better therapies for acute stroke. Okay, that's what the students found. If we go back to the original thing, there was a 9% increase with the red dice, a 22% decrease with the white-green dice. And they said, okay, there was obviously, the red dice were obviously weighted in some way. And that's what the students found, except the students were lied to. All the dice were identical. The differences that the students saw were purely due to chance. And what's really funny is that even when they were told this, many of the students did not believe the researchers. So some of the participants were convinced their own dice were really loaded. When student A started on the control group, he rolled 1 6, followed by another, and then a third. And he said that his room felt eerily quiet as he rolled a 4th 6. He had never rolled 4 6s in a row in his life. But of course, you can roll 4 6s in a row, right? If you get enough people together in a room throwing enough dice, eventually one of them is going to roll 4 6s in a row. Unlikely things do happen. And, it's just as likely that you can roll 4 6s in a row in the same way that if you put enough monkeys in front of enough typewriters, eventually you will get the complete works of William Shakespeare. And this feeds into a concept called multiple hypothesis testing, which many of you might be familiar with. The problem with multiple hypothesis testing is that we set a type 1 error rate when we do research. Basically, we decide in advance what is the probability that you will claim there's a difference between 2 therapies or 2 groups when none actually exists. And by convention, we set that at 5%, which is sort of where the 95% confidence interval comes from, but not really. But that's not important for today. So this 5% number, and you might say, okay, that seems a little bit high, which it is. But by convention, we've set it at 5%, and that's, tolerable. And that's fine if you're doing 1 test. But if you do 2 tests, the possibility that you'll get at least 1 false positive result is actually up to 9.75%. Do this for 5 tests, you'll get 22.6%. Do this for 10 tests, you'll get 40%. And so the problem with a lot of this is that if you do enough testing, you will eventually get a false positive result. I wrote an article for EvidenceBased Medicine a few years ago now. And it was basically a commentary on a study that was published by the National Toxicology Program about rats and mice and whether cell phones cause cancer. And very briefly, for anybody who wants to go, you can go find the article online. Obviously, it's free. You can just search for my name and the title, and you will find it. Basically, what researchers did was they took rats and mice, exposed them to cell phone signals for 16 hours a day over 2 years. and found that there was a signal for cardiac schwannomas in the male rats and also a signal for malignant gliomas. Now, this study was significant for a number of reasons. Number one, that was the day I learned that rats and mice are not actually the same animal and are in fact different species. So that was an interesting day for me. But what was also interesting is that when you break down what the researchers actually found, there was no cancer signal in male mice, no cancer signal in female mice, no cancer signal in female rats. There was only a cancer signal for male rats, but only for 2 specific types of cancer, and for one of these only with 1 type of cell phone signal. And so looking at this globally, you would assume that just by random chance, you're going to see some positive associations, and that this would all be due to multiple hypothesis testing. And so that seemed obvious to me. And yet many people, and even the researchers, talked about this as if this was a positive study. And the problem with multiple hypothesis testing is that if you don't realize you're doing it, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And, we've talked about p-hacking, as I'm sure many of you have probably heard about already, this idea that if you do enough tests, you'll eventually get a p-value of less than 0.05, which is the threshold that we use for statistical significance. But if you don't realize what you're doing, you're going to run into trouble. And one of the greatest examples of that is Brian Wansink. Now, many of you may not know who this is, and yet you've probably heard about his research. Brian Wansink was the director of the Cornell Food Lab. And he wrote this blog post called "The Student Who Never Said No." And the basic thread of the blog post, you can still find it archived online, even though he's taking down the main post now. He had this grad student, and he told her, she came to him with, saying that, oh, there's no association in this data set that we had. And he said, you keep analyzing that data until you find something that we can publish. And in the end, she published 4 papers out of that data set. Just like, look how great a mentor I am. That was the basic idea of the blog post. And a lot of people commented online. They were like, Brian, is this something you do with like all your students and all your research? Do you just keep analyzing the data over and over again until you find something that's interesting? And he was like, yeah, what's the problem? And then people went back and they said, oh, this might not be good. And a lot of his studies had to get retracted because the stats just weren't there. A lot of what he did was just multiple hypothesis testing. And this is problematic because you can get anything published in a medical journal or a scientific journal, provided you're willing to ignore all the negative stuff that comes with it. And this leads to the issue of publication bias, which is relevant because if you're only publishing the positive studies and not publishing the negative studies, you are not going to appreciate that some things are maybe not as effective as you think they are. And this happened with SSRIs, antidepressants. So Eric Turner, who's a physician in the US, was working at the FDA. I interviewed him for a story. That's how in an article once. That's why I know the backstory of this. He says he was working at the FDA and he was a little bit surprised that there were all these negative studies on antidepressants that just weren't getting published. And most people didn't know about them, even though they had been submitted to the FDA as the law required. And so he did an analysis of all the papers and found that if the study on SSRIs was positive, it was more likely to get published because it agreed with the FDA decision, whereas the questionable and negative studies were less likely to get published. And so if you have this skewed version of reality, you are going to believe things that are not true. Now, the obvious solution to this is replication, right? Do a study again, and if you get the same results, then you can be pretty confident that it's true. The problem is we tend not to do replication in science in the same way that you tend not to get a lot of replication in magic shows. It's easy to do something once. It's hard to do something twice. And most studies are actually not replicated. Probably less than half by some estimates, either because they were never replicated or because the subsequent results were less impressive than the results that came initially. Now, we could fix this with open data where we could just have access to raw data so that everybody can reanalyze the data and make sure we're coming to the same conclusions as everybody else. The problem is there is a lot of resistance to this. And just to touch back on antidepressants, some of you may not know about study 329, but it was one of the first studies to suggest that there was a potential risk for suicidality with antidepressants when they were prescribed to young people. And what's relevant about this is that that signal for harm was not actually made public because the study data was being suppressed by the pharmaceutical industry. They were sort of recategorizing some adverse events as being, rather than calling it suicide, they were calling it emotional lability or a neurological side effect. So they were trying to obscure the data, and it took a very, very long time for this information to be made available to researchers so they could analyze this data properly. So that's random chance and p-hacking. The third possibility to explain why sometimes results are wrong is something called bias, which is a very different thing in the scientific sense compared to how we use the term colloquially. There's two basic types of bias. There's actually 74 different types of bias, but in general terms, there's two types of bias: selection bias and information bias. Selection bias is errors in how we select patients. Information bias is errors in how we collect data. A famous example of selection bias, and the thing that inspired the title of the book, was coffee and cancer of the pancreas. This was a famous study published in the New England Journal of Medicine that suggested that coffee tripled the risk of pancreatic cancer, which is, not great if true. The problem, though, is that researchers, the way they did the study was they went to hospitals and picked pancreatic cancer patients. They recruited them into the study, meaning, and they gave them questionnaires about what do you eat, what do you drink, and they were initially looking at coffee and alcohol, but they did eventually also include in their questionnaires questions about coffee. But of course, in every study, you also need a control group, so they picked controls from the same GI ward. And what they failed to appreciate was that at the time, in an era before proton pump inhibitors and antibiotics and a recognition that Helicobacter pylori, the bacteria, is what causes stomach ulcers, a lot of people were in hospital because they had stomach ulcers and they were getting surgery. They were having a partial gastrectomy. They were having parts of their stomach surgically removed to treat their ulcers, which was a common treatment in the 1970s and 1980s. And the problem, as I think most of you might be able to sort of figure out, is that people with ulcers tend not to drink coffee, right? Because it can be irritating and upsetting to their stomach. So what happened was you had two diseases that themselves are not related, and yet they are both linked because the patients are hospitalized together. And so you create a link between the exposure, which is coffee, the disease A, which is gastric ulcers, the hospitalization, and then linking back to pancreatic cancer. So you create this association here in a very classic example of something that has a very, very specific name called Bergson's bias. And the reason that we now have a recognition of Bergson's bias is why there's a general feeling now that if you're going to do studies on hospitalized patients, you have to be careful, because hospitalized patients are not reflective of the general population. Because if you're going to compare pancreatic cancer patients to gastric ulcer patients, yeah, there's a difference in how much coffee they drink. But if you compare pancreatic cancer patients to the general population, there is no difference in coffee consumption, and coffee really has nothing to do with the pathogenesis of pancreatic cancer. The other type of bias is information bias, and this is based on the unfortunate reality that people lie on questionnaires, right? People underreport their smoking, they overreport height, they underreport weight. And this is so done in such a predictable and regular fashion that there's actually correction factors that exist, where if you ask people about their height and weight, you know how to adjust for it because they tend to under and overrepresent this in predictable ways. But this is particularly problematic when we talk about food questionnaires, because food questionnaires are very inaccurate for a very, very simple reason. They're very complicated. This is an example of a food questionnaire. So let's read the instructions together for a second. Please try to average your seasonal use of foods over the entire year. For example, if a food such as cantaloupe is eaten 4 times a week during the approximate 3 months that it is in season, then the average use would be once per week. I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure people aren't doing complicated math like this when they're filling out food questionnaires, when you consider that they have to do it for every single food on the list. And these food questionnaires can go on for several dozen pages. Like, it takes about an hour and a half to fill out one of these things. So I think the problem with food questionnaires is that a lot of them are frankly just guesses. They are, you're asking people to sort of remember how many eggs they ate over, a 6-month period. which is hard because a lot of us, we don't prepare our own food, right? You eat lunch at, the cafeteria at work. You maybe go out for dinner with your friends. You're not really counting how many eggs you eat. And does that count the eggs that are in baked goods? Like, this is really complicated. And that's partly why medical studies have shown such heterogeneous results when it comes to the potential carcinogenicity of various foods, because our ability to collect and measure data accurately is a problem. Although one of my favorite examples is this idea of chocolate being linked to Nobel Prizes. If you go back to this study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Franz Mercerli, what he basically did was he plotted the number of Nobel Prizes that every country has won, plotted it against chocolate consumption per capita, and said, look, there's a very clear linear association between the amount of chocolate that countries eat and the number of Nobel Prizes they won, which is, fascinating and interesting, generated a lot of headlines. But there's a problem with this type of analysis. Countries don't win Nobel Prizes, and countries don't eat chocolate. People win Nobel Prizes, and people eat chocolate. And you can't establish that the people who eat chocolate are the ones who are going out to win Nobel Prizes. And this problem is so common that it actually has a name in science. It's called the ecological fallacy. And it's the assumption that country-level exposures apply to individuals. Okay, so it's not that you can't use country-level data, but you have to realize they don't necessarily apply to individuals. And the final point, the final possibility of the potential alternative explanations for X is associated with Y is that this is all due to confounding. Now, bias is our fault. We make it happen. Confounding exists in nature, and it's something we have to overcome. And since I'm going to assume most of you don't find epidemiology as fascinating as I do, I will just briefly explain to you that a confounder is essentially a third variable that links the exposure to an outcome of a disease. And so if you were to study lung cancer, you might find that people who carry lighters in their pockets are more likely to get lung cancer. That's true. Okay, that is not an incorrect assumption. But people who carry lighters are also more likely to smoke, and smokers obviously are more likely to get lung cancer. So smoking confounds the association between cigarette lighters and lung cancer. And you can do this for multiple different subjects. You can do this for vitamins and mortality because, vitamin use varies by age. And of course, age is a big predictor of mortality. And you can do this in such systematic, or rather, this happens so often that if you just rely on observational type research from databases and observational studies and questionnaires, you will see benefits that do not replicate the minute you do a randomized controlled trial, which is why we talk about randomized controlled trials as being the gold standard. Because with confounding, and there are numerous other examples of it, hormone replacement therapy being an obvious one, they can never be fully adjusted away with statistics. Okay, you always need randomization to completely eliminate confounding. The problem is randomization is not always successful. And, there was a very famous study about the appendectomies where they were doing a study to compare a laparoscopic versus an open technique for removing somebody's appendix. And what the residents were doing is they were holding the envelopes with the allocation to the study up to the light to see if somebody was supposed to get the open or the laparoscopic technique. And so the residents, for a variety of very complex reasons, were actually messing with the randomization. So all this to say, randomized studies are, of course, the gold standard, but they are not always successful. And sometimes they can go wrong in very, very comical ways. Now, imagine a perfect world where there is no confounding, no bias, no error, and reverse causation. The problem is most people don't really understand statistics, okay? You can see a study like this suggesting that having a coffee increases the risk of heart attack by 50%, a risk ratio of 1.5. So you can ask yourself, well, increasing the risk of heart attack by 50%, well, what does that actually mean? Like 50% above what? And this study was accompanied by a very funny editorial where Charles Poole said, to the editor, just before taking my first sip of coffee, I read the study about by Balin et al. Suggesting a 1.5 risk of myocardial infarction. And I said, what did this mean in more meaningful terms? And he goes through the math and he said, now I had my answer. It would mean an expectation on average of about 1 extra heart attack in the hour immediately following the consumption of 2 million cups of coffee. So telling people that a risk ratio is equal to 1.5 is akin to a risk difference of 0.00000005, which translates into a number needed to harm of 2 million. And so telling people that something increases your risk of coffee by 50% is very, very scary. Telling people that it takes 2 million cups of coffee to cause 1 heart attack, I think puts things in a little bit of a clear perspective. Another thing, which is a bit of a more advanced level topic, is that, most people, I think, nowadays have heard about relative versus absolute risk, but many people have not really heard about the issue with odds ratios and risk ratios and hazard ratios. And we sort of throw these terms around as if they're all the same, but they're not. And one way in which researchers got it very, very wrong was the study published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they took actors, these are pictures of actors, and they had them read a text. And they showed these videos at a cardiology conference, and they asked the cardiologist, what would you do? Would you send this patient for an angiogram or not? And they found that there was a difference between the angiography rates between the white and the black actors. And so this led to a lot of different headlines. And they said, 60% decrease, 60% decrease, because they had an odds ratio of 0.6, which was all well and good. But then a different group of researchers and said, well, yes, you reported the odds ratio of 0.6, but the risk ratio was actually 0.93. So what you should have said that there was a 7% difference, not a 40% difference. And they were both right. And I'll spare you the math because we are getting a little bit short on time and I do want to explain this to people. The point is that risks and odds are not the same thing. If you're going to roll a dice, the risk of rolling a 4 is 1 in 6. But the odds of rolling a 4 are 1 in 5. And so odds ratios and risk ratios mean different things, but you often see them used interchangeably, especially as we talk about science. So, a 75% risk is equal to an odds of 3. And while a 75% chance of something happening is easy to understand, if I told you the odds of being struck by a car are 3, that's not really something people intuitively understand. And so odds ratios are not the best way to communicate science to the public, and yet we use them because they are very mathematically useful. And of course, I use them when I do statistics. So odds ratios are more mathematically useful, but risk ratios make more sense clinically, because if you're going to go and talk to the general public and say there's a 40% difference in angiography rates between white and black, people in America, that's very, very concerning. But when you say it's actually closer to 70%, I mean, that's still a problem. And I'm not, there's obviously still issues about systemic inequalities in healthcare, which we really have to address. But it's important that we use the right statistics to explain that, because otherwise we are not communicating science effectively. So at this point, given that I've told you all the problems that exist in food research and research in general, you might be asking yourself, why bother with any of this? If much of the medical literature is wrong and research is pointless, what's the reason to keep going on? And I'll be honest with you, sometimes I feel like this, right? I feel like you're trying to sort of communicate good information to the public, and, they have a lot of unfortunate sources that are giving them bad information. But, there's a moral to the story, if only you can find it. And the moral to the story is that we are better now than we have ever been. I mean, there have been multiple victories of evidence-based medicine. We no longer give class 1 antiarrhythmics to people after heart attack, which is probably something most of you have never heard of. And that's a good thing, because class 1 antiarrhythmics should not be given to patients after a heart attack. We don't give hormone replacement therapy to women anymore, at least not routinely. We give it to treat specific menopausal symptoms, but it's not routinely prescribed like it once was. COX-2 inhibitors like Vioxx were taken off the market. We passed anti-smoking laws because of evidence-based medicine and because of the research that went into it, and life expectancy keeps going up. And so while there are problems with evidence-based medicine, it is the best system we got. And that's what this book is a little bit, that's what this book is about. It's not so much telling people what to eat and what to do, because you can eat whatever you want, right? You can eat junk food, it's fine. That's how life works. The point of the book is to dispel a lot of these myths, not by me telling you that what's true and what's not, but helping you to understand why things go wrong so that you can be a better health consumer in the future. And that's why, a book that would have normally been very, very math heavy is sprinkled into a romantic comedy to make it a little bit more entertaining to read. And that's what I hope people get out of it. I hope people come away from reading this book saying, oh, I learned a lot, but that was actually kind of a fun read. So yeah, that's what this is about. If you want to see what the book is about, this is just a plug for the podcast I do with my friend Jonathan. We also have a special sports science series about that with another voice from Skeptical Inquirer Presents that you might recognize if you go and listen back to some of our old episodes. And yeah, this is the book. And like I said, if you want to see what a romantic comedy about science communication and epidemiology sounds like, you can log on and listen to a full chapter reading done by me and my friend Jonathan, who co-hosts the podcast with me. So as promised and on cue at just under the 45-minute mark, I will take your questions.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Christopher. That was a fascinating talk. I'm sure everybody at home or wherever you're watching agrees. I've seen so many of these science and skepticism talks now, and I always learn something new, and I learned several new things in that. So thank you so much, Chris. It really struck a nerve with me when you were talking specifically about the publication bias in the medical and scientific literature. And it just, I remember trying to get a paper published years ago, and it got 3 desk rejections from journals. That means they rejected it outright without even sending it for review.
Yeah.
They rejected it on the basis that we didn't have statistically significant findings.
Yeah.
That was their reason for rejecting the paper, which is just really atrocious, because a non-significant finding is still a finding, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got quite a few questions that have come in as expected. So Ellie, it's Ellie or Eli. I'm going to assume Ellie, so I apologize if I've got your name wrong. What should we look for to make sure that we actually have a valid study? So you've talked about a lot of good science and a lot of bad science. So Ellie wants to know, what do we look for to make sure that it is a valid and reliable study, and what sort of constitutes a true study? I know that's a difficult one to try and articulate, but what are 1 or 2 things that we might be able to look out for?
I mean, here's the thing. There's various levels, right? So, I mean, there's some very, very basic stuff that you can look for, even if you don't have a scientific background or a medical background. One, was it done in humans rather than in animals, right? Is it being done, by reputable people at a reputable university in a reputable journal rather than, some shady type people who are publishing in like a, lower tier journal. I mean, that being said, just even publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine, there's no guarantee of accuracy. Like many of the examples I pointed out were from high-end journals. The sort of stuff does happen. But, that's sort of that. It's again, was it a randomized trial as opposed to observational research? So did they actually experiment on people? This happens a lot with vitamin D, right? Where a lot of it is, oh, you have low vitamin D levels. Low vitamin D levels are associated with cancer. But when you actually give people a vitamin D tablet, it doesn't actually decrease the risk of cancer. So making sure that if you're going to talk about an intervention, they actually tested the intervention and they didn't just do an observational study. So those are sort of the big things, right? Is it in humans? Is it a randomized trial? Was it published in a fairly sort of good journal coming out of a university center? But none of these in and of themselves is enough, because a lot of this stuff is very subtle and it takes a lot of specialized training to do this stuff properly. And I think that's why you need professional people to do this sort of thing, because you can't expect the public, and also the problem is a lot of these papers are behind a paywall, right? So you're like, oh, I want to go read the original research. Sometimes you can't because it's behind the paywall. And, most people are not going to subscribe to the Journal of the American Medical Association. Why would you? So it's unfortunate that while you can do very, very basic things, a lot of the sort of higher end stuff is somewhat beyond your control as a consumer, which is why you need good sources to vet this for you. In the same way that you can't inspect your own food, you're relying on the FDA or Health Canada to inspect your food for you to make sure there aren't, egg parasites in your meat, right? So we need to create systems to protect us, because you can't, it can't be it can't be every man, woman, and child for himself. It can't be on you to interpret the scientific evidence. We need to have thresholds in place to actually keep it of good quality.
And I guess just being aware that not all studies are created equal is a good place to start. And as you alluded to, Chris, I know how to change the oil in my car, and I can change a tire, but there's going to be at some point I'm just going to have to take it to a mechanic, somebody who knows a lot more about it than me. So that's why we need experts. Okay, Bertha Vasquez is online. Hi, Bertha. Bertha wants to know, when you were talking about hormone replacement therapy, you mentioned that a couple of times. What is the confounding effect with hormone replacement therapy that you alluded to?
So if you go back to pre-2002, before the publication of the Women's Health Initiative study, what happened was there was a lot of observational research where, they would go out, they would send out a questionnaire, they would recruit a group of women, they would ask them, are you taking hormone replacement therapy? And they would say yes or no. And then they would follow them long-term and look to see who would get heart disease. And the women who were taking hormone replacement therapy would get less heart disease. But what people didn't sort of appreciate fully is that the women who were already taking hormone replacement therapy were doing so because they were being more proactive about their health, right? They were going to their doctor, they were getting hormone replacement therapy, they were healthier on average, they were eating better, they would exercise more. And so these women were healthier at baseline, which is why they had less heart disease. And researchers did try to adjust for all these things, right? These people, I mean, when these things happen, it's not because people are like blissfully unaware of all this stuff. They tried. But you can never adjust for that degree of accuracy perfectly, because not everybody's going to be honest with you if you ask them if they're a smoker. People are not going to be, how often do you exercise? You're like, sometimes. I don't know how many minutes per week, right? There's always some degree of inaccuracy when you're asking people to self-report information. And so you needed to do a randomized trial. And that randomized trial was called the Women's Health Initiative. It was published in 2002, where it showed really no difference in cardiovascular disease, a slight increase in breast cancer, a slight decrease in colorectal cancer, but very, overall, no real difference. So a lot of people have went out of this thinking hormone replacement therapy is bad for you. It's not. It's just not good as a prophylactic therapy. So we use it exclusively for women who have menopausal symptoms, not routinely to all women the minute they get menopause.
There you go, straight from the doctor's mouth. Susan has a good question. How much confusion about statistics is found among practicing physicians? And before let me just preface your answer by saying that I'm a researcher by profession, and I see a lot of confusion about statistics in professional researchers. So people whose job it is to do research. So I can only imagine that you see a lot of this in medicine as well, no?
Right, yeah, because most medical doctors do not get statistical training. And again, if you went back a generation, like the type of research, not every field of research requires statistics, right? If you're going to do lab research and you're experimenting on rats, you don't really need to understand statistics in any very, very complex way. And so a generation ago, because medicine was simpler and statistics and research was simpler, you could get away with some very, very basic stuff. I think now, because all the low-hanging fruit is gone, right? So now we're doing very, very complex stuff. The statistics have become much, much more complicated. And I think now a lot of people just don't have the statistical grounding. So you need professional statisticians or epidemiologists or both to be part of any research program. The problem is you don't necessarily have those. And again, I've always said that I think basic statistics should be part of medical training now, because you need to do this, not just to do research, but to read the research, which has gotten much more complicated. If you go back to Dahl and Hill, these were the two people who first sent out that survey to show that smoking was associated with lung cancer, right? This is a very famous study in the history of medicine, Dahl and Hill. Their research paper was really basic by modern standards, like really, really, really basic. And so back then, it was acceptable, and now it wouldn't even pass muster. So we need to up our game, because general medical training now requires a level of statistical knowledge that probably and generally wasn't necessary a generation ago.
Yeah, very true, very true. I've got a question here from Victor. The plot showing studies of, so you were just talking about cancer trials. The plot showing studies of diet versus cancer showed that most, he's highlighted most of the studies on meat were positive.
Yeah.
So would that suggest that there may be some validity to the claim that the high consumption of meat increases the risk of cancer, or is that, are we overstepping? Are we making correlations that don't exist?
Yeah. So there's a whole chapter in the book about red meat. So you read the book, but I will spoil it for you if you want sort of the final conclusion. And now the interesting thing about the book is that you often don't, in the story, you don't actually come to a final conclusion. You kind of do, but I think I sort of lead people to realize that, yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty. When it comes to meat, I think if you're going to synthesize it down to one point, does eating red meat regularly increase your risk of cancer? The answer is yes. Okay. I think if you put a gun to my head, is it yes or no? It's closer to yes. Now, the magnitude of that increase is relatively small. If you're of average risk, your lifetime risk of colon cancer is about 5%, 4 to 5%. If you eat meat every day, the synthesis of the research will take you up to maybe like 6%. So you're talking about a 1% absolute risk over your lifetime. Some people are going to look at that and be like, well, I'll just eat less red meat. I don't care. People are like, nah, that's acceptable risk. I don't care. I like eating bacon. And then you start getting into all this nuance. Most of the research that ties meat to cancer is mostly for colorectal cancer, not so much for other types of cancer. It's more with processed red meat. So like bacon, ham, sausage, stuff where you're transforming the meat, not necessarily the steak that you're barbecuing on your barbecue on the weekends. And it's really with red meat, not necessarily with white meat. And now the question becomes, what is the difference between red meat and white meat? Nick, do you want to hazard scientifically, what is the difference between red meat and white meat? Do you want to hazard a guess? Because there actually is a clear definition that is not quite the way most people talk about red and white meat.
Well, from a basic perspective, it's myoglobin is the difference in the
Right.
color, the pigment, right?
Yeah.
But I don't, in terms of the risk, the cholesterol is different.
Well, no, but like the animals, like how do you point to an animal and be like, you're red meat, you're white meat? Because because there's this very complex thing, right? If you talk to chefs and they're like, well, veal, if it's this age, is white meat, but actually scientifically, no, it's a lot more straightforward than that. Because
is it animals with red meat eat something to do with the way that they digest food or the type of food they eat?
No, it's
go ahead. Put me out of my misery.
There's all this complex stuff out there. It's much more straightforward. It's mammals. Mammals are red meat. Birds are white meat. Okay. So
I should have known that actually.
Yeah, but this is the thing, right? Because we've heard slogans like pork, the other white meat, or veal is healthier. No, this is just all. So the pork, the other white meat, right? The slogan that a lot of people, especially people in the US, have heard, is a marketing slogan. It has no scientific validity whatsoever. So much of what we believe about food, like breakfast is the most important meal of the day, marketing slogan. And so I touch on these things in the book. So you sort of get a little bit of history as well, which I find is interesting. But yeah, so that's the whole thing with meat. It's not a yes or no answer. It's very complicated and very nuanced. And just sort of to talk about the book briefly, in the book, you have two characters. One's a vegetarian, one's not. And, there's sort of a romance underlying that. So there's a bit of romantic tension there. But these people have this argument, and at the end of the chapter, they can come to the conclusion that we're like, well, we can disagree about how we want to go forward. And the one who's a vegetarian is like, well, I'm going to be vegetarian. I don't want to kill animals. And the guy who likes eating meat is like, well, that's not that bad. I can live with that, but maybe I'll try it a little bit healthier too. So you can understand how different people can look at the evidence and come to different conclusions once you strip away all the fluff and be like, well, this is what the actual data shows. It's 5% to 6% absolute lifetime risk of colon cancer. So, judge, how much do you like bacon?
And you just mentioned that your book is sort of, it's like a romantic comedy. How did you come up with that concept? Because obviously most popular science books are fairly didactic in nature. Yeah. This is a fairly novel way, pun unintended, to sort of using story as the medium to deliver the facts. So how did you come up with this concept?
So the first chapter, when I was first pitching the book, was it was very didactic. It was the coffee chapter, and I wrote about all these things about selection bias, and I thought it was really good. And, we're pitching it around, and I spoke to one of the editors, and they were like, yeah, it's good, but do you have any other ideas? And I said, well, I do this podcast with my friend Jonathan. And, it's like a dialogue. Like, and on the podcast, if you've ever listened to it, it's called The Body of Evidence, right? Self-plug. The podcast, Jonathan and I are essentially playing characters based on ourselves. So there's a lot of like banter and like jokes, and we're playing versions of ourselves. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if you could have a dialogue? It's very Socratic. Like these people are going to be debating these issues. And so I thought, one of the characters can sort of ask the questions that the audience would have. And the editor was like, oh, it's very interesting. Make that happen. So I rewrote the chapter as a conversation between a doctor and a barista. And I thought it was very clever myself. We're going to talk about cancer and coffee. And I showed it to a friend of mine. I said, what do you think? Do you think people will like this idea of a dialogue? And so I emailed it to my friend, who was sort of the inspiration for the character of Casey. And she emails back to me and she's like, pretty good. But I kept expecting him to ask her out at the end. And the minute she said that, my brain exploded. I was like, oh my God, this is a romantic comedy. And so the whole book has this narrative arc. And when I sent it to the editor at the end, the feedback I got was like, oh, I wasn't expecting there to be like character development and like story arcs. And I was like, yeah, there is. So there actually is a story arc. And it was a bit of a worry to me because, you know, there's always the possibility that you're going to write this book and people are going to think that the science is too fluffy and that the story is ridiculous, right? You'll sort of fail on both counts. And I hope I succeeded on both. And the people who have read it told me like, no, it's an entertaining read. And you actually do learn a little bit. Like there is a lot. And there's all the references are at the end, right? So you can actually like dig into a lot of this stuff. So if you really want to get into like the science of the red meat stuff, you can actually go follow along, check the references, and look up all the controversies and see why there was this flip-flop with red meat and why within like a few months of each other, different professional groups came up with completely different recommendations of like, no, eat less meat. And another group was like, no, eat as much red meat as you want. And it was really weird. And so understanding why it got so weird is also part of the fun of, you know, delving into all these topics.
I think the narrative aspect, it works brilliantly, and I think it's an excellent way to communicate what can be. Sometimes it can be a little bit dry, and sometimes when you're delivering fact after fact after fact, it's fine if you are communicating to a science and skepticism audience because they're already primed for those types of facts. But humans are a storytelling species, so whenever you can use narrative and stories to deliver those messages, I think they're much more likely to be received. So kudos to you on that. I've got a couple of questions from Gail, which this is low-hanging fruit. She said, Gail says this is one of the best presentations I've ever seen on the topic. So congrats. Thank you. And when will this be available online so I can suggest it to my students in a skepticism class for seniors? So I can answer that one. It should be available online as early as tomorrow. So check the Skeptical Inquirer website and check the YouTube channel as well. And Gail also asks, are you familiar with the Science-Based Medicine website? And if so, what do you think about it? Well, Chris has actually written for Science-Based Medicine. So I'm assuming you think that is a good resource for all things science and skepticism.
Yeah, it is. It is. I wish I had time to write for them more. Like at some time I was entertaining the possibility of writing, you know, more regularly. And it's, you know, again, it's the issue I think as all of us have is just it's time, right? You just can't split yourself into that many parts. I mean, I do write for the Montreal Gazette, which is my local newspaper. So maybe I'm being, you know, fiercely patriotic and, you know, showing local community pride of preferentially writing for my local paper. But yeah, I think it's a very good website. I wish I had more time to write for them. I've written a few articles for them. So the one about the rats and mice and the cell phone cancer, I have one on cholesterol denialism that's on there. Forget what else I've done. There's been a couple over the years. I wish I had more. I wish there was a second version of me, just like that movie Multiplicity with who's in it? Anyways, it's not a movie,
Michael Keaton.
Michael Keaton, yeah.
It's a terrible movie.
I liked it. I kind of liked it. I think it has its moments.
Don't watch it, folks. It's really it's not a good movie. It's 2 hours you'll never get back. So we're starting to run short of time. I'm going to see if we can squeeze in this one from Jerry. This is a tough one to answer in less than 2 minutes. Here we go. Is there a way to register all studies before they are conducted with the idea of publishing only those studies that are registered? And then obviously this is me talking. We obviously see that in medicine, but not so much elsewhere. Is this something that you ever see happening? Will all studies be required to be pre-registered before being commenced?
I mean, that's the ideal. Whether we have the logistics to make it happen is going to be tough because you don't know what somebody's doing, right? Somebody might be analyzing their own data set, not telling you that they're doing the analysis. I think what is going to be the solution going forward is can you develop something called registered reports? And this is becoming very, very common in the social sciences, not so much in medicine yet. But it's this idea that you submit your proposal to a journal. You say, this is the study I'm going to run before you run it. So you don't have the results. And then they decide yes or no, does the study get published? So you write up the introduction and the methods and everything. And then all you send to them afterwards are the results. And what's fascinating is that that's how most people think science is done. They're like, oh, you just publish the results, whatever they are. And they're like, no, the journals decide if they think your study is interesting or not. So if we could make registered reports a more widespread thing, that would solve at least some of the issues of avoiding p-hacking and publication bias, which is like, this study is interesting, I'm going to publish it regardless of whether the results are positive or negative or not. Whereas now, if you have a very interesting question, it doesn't pan out, everybody's like, oh, well, throw it away, which is not right. So registered reports, if I had a magic wand and I could do one thing, that's the one thing I would fix about medical publication.
And I'm right, Chris, in saying that all clinical trials, especially drug trials, have to be pre-registered, right? But it's just, it's not a prerequisite for an observational trial, which, as you spoke about earlier, you could have somebody looking at 20 different comparisons and not correcting for multiple comparisons and having a bunch of false positives come up. And that's the problem with not having obligatory pre-registration.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, again, it's not going to solve every issue in medicine, but it's going to solve at least that one issue.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're just about out of time. We've got a couple of questions that we didn't get to, and I've got a couple of questions of my own that I'm gonna email to Chris afterwards. Take some liberties because there are things that I want to know. But we are very sadly out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Labos, for a fascinating talk. Don't forget, folks, does coffee cause cancer? And 8 more myths about the food we eat. So find out more about that online. The recording, as I said, will be available tomorrow. Join us for the next episode of Skeptical Inquirer Presents. I got a message from Barry Carr. The next meeting has been booked. It's on the 18th of April, so 2 weeks' time, by Peter Utes. He is a professor of systems biology at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, and his talk is called, "Is the Planet Full? What We Need to Know About Overpopulation." So that'll be a fascinating talk. Don't forget to join us for that. So once again, thank you to Dr. Labos. Thanks to Barry Carr. Thanks to our awesome producer, Eric Shaver, to the CSI, and of course, the wonderful audience, you lot at home, for joining us. I'm Dr. Nick Tiller. We will see you next time. Until then, stay skeptical.